As we all know, across the world, even in countries most vulnerable to disasters, fewer people are dying in floods and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and the like. But the economic toll of disasters is growing. Of course, it is a matter of great satisfaction that emergency responses, disaster preparedness has made great strides. Please do take a seat over here, ladies and gentlemen. There's room in the middle. You may have to shuffle along and make friends with your neighbors, but that's no bad thing. Make sure that you have headsets, please, because this is going to be a multilingual presentation. So as I was saying, even as we make progress in our emergency responses, as we make progress with our disaster preparedness, unfortunately, equivalent measures to address economies and livelihoods and assets have lagged way behind. So that's what this session is going to be all about. We are going to look at the efforts of different participants, of national governments, of global institutions, and the private sector. We're going to look at their efforts to upgrade their financial and their economic strategies, with a special focus on public investment in disaster risk management. And I want to make sure, ladies and gentlemen, that we're all involved in this discussion in the room, that it's not just about our eminent panelists here, who I'm going to introduce you to in a minute or two. Please listen actively, not just with your ears, but with your pens, and jot down questions that you would like to put to our panelists, because we're going to have lots of interventions and lots of opportunities for you to be able to have follow-up. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our eminent panelists. From Niger, we have His Excellency Saïdou Sidibé, the Minister and Director of the Cabinet of the Prime Minister. Welcome, Monsieur Sidibé. From Morocco, we have His Excellency Mohamed Najib Boulif, Minister of General Affairs and Governance. Welcome, Minister Boulif. From Indonesia, Deputy Minister for the Development of Special Regions, Dr. Supriyoga Hadi, very much involved in the Aceh relief efforts, a real hands-on man. From the OECD, Deputy Secretary General Yves Leterme. Welcome, Mr. Leterme. From Mexico, the National Coordinator of Civil Protection, Luis Felipe Puente Espinosa. Great to have you with us, Mr. Puente. From the World Bank, Vice President for Sustainable Development, Ms. Rachel Kite. World Bank, one of the sponsors for this session. Please do come on in, ladies and gentlemen. There are a few spots here and there in the middle, so you don't have to stand at the back. And last but not least, representing the corporate sector, we have from Nestlé, the Global Head of Risk Management, who has spearheaded Nestlé's risk management efforts for over a decade, Mr. Mark Shadley. Welcome to you all. So where should we begin? Perhaps we should begin with Minister Sidibé. Now, we know in Niger that you have had a major overhaul of your national strategy for disaster risk management over the last 5, 6, 7 years. Can you tell us what you've accomplished, how far you've got to, where you want to go? Briefly, thank you.
Thank you. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about Niger. It's a country that's not very well known. And for me, it's a great honor and a challenge. I think sub-Saharan Africa needs to have some attention. Now, Niger is in the center of the Sahara area. We have a great deal of drought. We focus mainly on preventive actions for drought. We have set up a mechanism that has allowed us to take preventive action and information, and we share this information with our partners and prepare responses and get the necessary financing. But in the past few years, we have noted after analysis that this very effective mechanism to relieve our populations has not helped us bring down the number of disasters. On the contrary, the number has risen. And so we have required further assistance. And catastrophes, these disasters, have made us look for more productive means to resolve the problem. And we've had to step up our budgets to fight against food insecurity. This means that the money that would go for financing of development is going there. The President of the Republic in 2011 proposed, following a very complete analysis, to engage in a certain strategy that would last 3 years. And this strategy uses the mechanism that we had to deal with emergencies, as I mentioned before, but it adds structural measures for food insecurity, for example. Through this strategy, we aim to intensify our interventions and promote our cattle raising, and to step that up. We're a country that produces a great deal of cattle and livestock. We had to deal with malnutrition as well, and health issues that are linked to the undernourishment of the population due to food insecurity. We have set up this strategy with a leading program. We are building dams that to cover 80 to 120,000 hectares that should be ready by 2016. And it should produce 25 megawatts of electricity and lead to a number of agricultural changes and facilitate the agricultural industry. This program has cost more than $2 billion, and it will conclude in 2015. And as I mentioned, in 2012, we, in the government, tried to test the mechanisms we had set up due to the food crisis and the low rainfall of 2011-2012. $450 million were injected into the economy, enabling us to come up with 700 million tons of food, and 692 is the normal production. We were able to save our livestock, and we have stepped up manpower to carry all this out. And through direct interventions, we have been able to help the populations living on their territories and engage in other activities as well. And this test period was quite telling. In 2000, $530 million are now being invested to address structural issues related to famine. We have several accompanying measures that are being carried out as well. First of all, we're training staff. Two problems arose. Those who had left the educational system until now were placed in educational centers And we have 206 counties, and we've created a number of these centers in these counties, and they will be given training to address the agricultural issues and provide services for the agricultural sector. And this service will and is enabling us to broaden our offer of services in the different counties through what we call the farmer's house. We will help them in terms of pesticides, tractors, supplies will be provided so that the farmer will be able to step up production. And now this is being combined with professional training. And the expertise provided them will help them become more efficient.
Minister Boulief, I thank you for getting us going. I'm going to ask you more about this public investment program in the next round of questioning. But if you don't mind, I'm going to bring, Minister Sidibé, I'm going to bring Minister Boulief in, if you don't mind. So thank you very much for starting. And so, Minister Boulief, we've also seen in Morocco a big change in the whole approach to disaster risk management, from bringing the thinking way up forward, data collection, risk analysis. Can you tell us where you've got to with your new approach and where you've still got to go, briefly? Thank you.
Okay, merci, c'est bien gentil.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. We are from northern part of North Africa, and what is particular about our country is that we have initiated a national strategy that is an integrated one. We are not only focusing on natural disasters, but we are also addressing the issue of financial risks and issues related to agriculture. Now, we started this in 2009, and it was at this time that we started feeling that Morocco was a high-risk country, and we had a certain number of problems. In 2004, we had a disaster that caused a great deal of damage, and we've worked on in terms of phases. We started our integrated strategy, and we are now in the second phase. And we've also tried to analyze impacts on the economy, on the national economy, and regional economies, to analyze the impact on the population, and in terms of infrastructure. So in terms of these three kinds of impact, we have tried to determine with a certain number of scientific elements how we could come up with a plan, a national plan. And we have an information system right now that allows us, not only nationally, but regionally, and on the county level, as you would say here in Switzerland, on the communes, to determine what the impact will be if a critical event, if a disaster arrived in our country. So we are carrying out a certain number of evaluations concerning the probability that a natural disaster would occur, because they occur every 250%, 0.4%. But we have determined that would cost 1.7 billion euros just for this event. For this event, that would happen every 250 years. So then we have what if scenario. What would happen if a certain scenario occurred? So we are working on 5 major disasters: earthquakes, floods, drought, landslides, and tsunamis. Many people know this, that we had one of the oldest tsunamis in history, one 1555, and there was a tsunami that inundated Casablanca, one of the biggest cities, and there were 8-meter-high waves that flooded the city. So we are currently working on these 5 areas, and we're trying to decide how we could meet the needs of the population should this occur. So we are trying to work out how much we should invest, what, and how we can ensure that we will come up with the right results. We're setting up a center of excellence because we should not forget that we not only do we have to invest in the infrastructure to manage risk, but we have to make a soft investment, that is in education, awareness raising, and we have even taken up a community approach to raise awareness in the communes and the communities so that we can decide on how we will act. And within the next 2 weeks, we will be visiting the area with the World Bank to meet with experts in the area with Vietnam and study what is happening in Vietnam to see how they've managed their risks. So these are the different phases that I've mentioned before, and we will see further on.
So we heard from Niger, where the approach is very much on building up the agriculture, on famine relief, making sure the dreadful events of 2005 don't happen again. We've heard from Morocco, where it's incredibly analytical, very data-rich, looking at a number of different hazards, extremely comprehensive. Now let's hear from Indonesia, where Dr. Yoga is Deputy Minister, is very much involved in trying to build up resilience. And Indonesia has also taken a real sector-by-sector and very regional approach. Tell us about it, Dr. Yoga.
Thank you, Nisha. Actually, what we have done so far, maybe since the 2006, it's already been put in our National Action Plan for disaster risk reduction. And we try to compile up to 22 line ministries already involved in the disaster risk reduction. And also, we also invite the collaboration and also the contribution from the private sector, as well as the NGOs into our initiative for the DRR. And it means that we are dealing with the DRR in terms of the investment since the very beginning, because we are not talking about how to spend the money from the government, from the private sector, or from the NGOs, or maybe the development partners externally for doing the recovery process that we have been experiencing in Aceh or in Yogyakarta, the big one. But since 2006, we are trying to put our attention for the investment of the DRR. It means that that collaboration actually from the government, central government, subnational government, and also local government, plus the contribution from the private sector as well as from the local NGOs and also the international NGO, try to be focusing on the investment on the DRR. So that's the way we are trying to see that the shifting paradigm from the previously related to the response funding towards the investment on the future disaster risk management.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us it from the ground and so succinctly. I really appreciate that, Dr. Yoga. Mr. Leterme, give us an OECD perspective on this, trying to move people away from just getting the assessments, firstly from responses to assessments, and then into setting up effective financial strategies. How does one guide that process?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to underline that there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution. So, and the second remark is that from the experiences and the introductions by the colleagues here at the table, you can kind of feel that there is a momentum. For the moment, the awareness of public political leadership in lots of countries is growing about the need for a comprehensive strategy for strengthening the prevention, but also strengthening the all kinds of policy tools we have at our disposal to try to avoid and then to tackle the consequences of risks. For us, basically, the OECD is a place where best practices are exchanged and where countries meet to exchange these best practices, their experiences, and try to find some guiding principles for policy making. And I would like to give you some of them. First of all, it's very important to be comprehensive in that sense that you have a whole of a government approach, that all parts of governance are implied in your approach, in the way you try to approach and build up policies concerning risk management. Related to that is to have a policy, and we heard from the examples of the colleagues that from country to country, let's say the sensitivity for risk is related to very typically locally determined circumstances. But it's, notwithstanding that, it's very important to have not only a whole of a government approach, but also to try to tackle all hazards, to take into account all hazards. Not only the one you primarily think of when you think about what's happening in Indonesia, what's happening in Niger, and what's happening in Morocco, but for all these countries to take into account the possibility, even the probability that at a certain moment a kind of risk will occur, which is not the first one you think about when you think about that country. So whole of a government approach, all hazards, and then of course to have a successful whole of government approach, it is really essential to have one central focal point at a substantial high political level. I've been a prime minister myself in a country, and I know that it makes a difference. I've done other things in government. I've been Minister for Agriculture, where it makes a lot of difference when you say things and you organize meetings as a prime minister or as a Minister for Agriculture, with all respect, due respect for the colleagues which are in charge of agriculture. And so having a whole of a government approach, taking on board all hazards, but also one focal point which has the political coverage, the political leadership of the number one of the government, and of course, one focal point intending to coordinate policy action which is needed at all policy levels, not only the federal level or the state level or only the local level or only the municipalities which are located in regions which are more prone to have the kind of catastrophes. No, all levels of governance and in a good interaction and coordination. Next step is, of course, risk assessment, but really based not only on evidence, but also on scientific research, very, very good scientific research, in order to have an idea about probability, about consequences of what could happen. And then, of course, you have two volets, two parts of a policy, which is, the number one is prevention, trying to strengthen awareness of people for what could happen. And then, of course, also the financial aspects, which are at the core of our discussion here, how you tackle from a financial point of view, budgetary point of view, consequences of a disaster, where basically you have 5, 6 questions at least you have to put forward. I mean, is it a kind of disaster taking into account a probability where you have to have a very important front-loading to be ready from your budget, from your yearly budget in budgetary terms to put the money immediately on the table? Or can you, because of the probability, can you work with special vehicles where you kind of set aside money on a yearly basis in order to have enough money when the disaster is happening? Another kind of question is, what is the part of the public part? What is the public part? The part of the public authorities? What is the part the private sector can take on board?
You're giving us a wonderful overview for our discussion, Mr. Leterme.
Yeah.
And these questions are going to be unpacking and hopefully slicing into in the course of the discussion. But thank you for now.
Okay.
Having talked about funding mechanisms, I think it would be a good point to bring in Mr. Puente from Mexico, because Mexico has done some really innovative stuff with financing. Can you hear me? Can people at the back not hear me? Is it all right? Maybe I just need to look at you. Is that better? I shall gaze adoringly at the audience. So having heard about different funding options there from Mr. Leterme, this might be a good point to draw into the conversation Mr. Puente from Mexico, because Mexico has been very innovative in the use of its financing alternatives and options. Let's find out a bit more about how effective they've actually been and what we can all learn from that. Mr. Puente?
Gracias.
Thank you. It is a pleasure for me to speak to you today. I'd like to share our experience with you in terms of financing for risk reduction. It's very important to understand risk, so we can get, and we know that if we have better information, then we will choose better methods to intervene. We have to be rational when we take decisions and have effective measures to reduce risk and prioritize for mitigation. We have to know the elements that intervene and understand the social context. This is our basic concept. We believe in participation, taking decisions, and developing policies. We have to know everything involved in risk and address social issues, strengthen the capacity of the government and of society, and improve development and territorial planning. And we have been strengthening national response through certain tools, prevention, and FONDEM, which is an organization for natural disasters. And we have tried to work on early prevention to intervene, stepping up social communication in all sectors. We work on intervention, and we see that prevention is an important key. In 2004, in our operation called PREVEN, we saw that preventive action could be carried out and to strengthen our capacity to respond through financial projects that would help us carry out actions aimed at identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities and risks. Reducing these risks could be due to natural disasters, and strengthening up our capacity to intervene and develop a culture of prevention and protection of the population. Our administration, led by President Peña, aims above all to change the trend and focus on these issues. We must invest more in prevention through PREVEN and deal with emergencies in this way and bring down costs. And the fund for disasters, we have a technique by state by state, and we're trying to develop local schemes and deal with risks through insurance. And we have bonuses and payouts in terms of disasters. Through financing, we hope we will be able to develop a policy that will focus on prevention so that we can help those who we have the honor to serve. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mr. Puente. We want to find out more about some of those insurance approaches to financing a bit later on. Rachel Kite, the World Bank is sort of at the heart of a number of these kind of efforts through the GFDRR. What kind of approaches are you finding come to you at the World Bank from different countries? What kind of support, what kind of things are countries looking for support in? And how can you position yourself to actually give them the encouragement they need?
Thank you. Well, I think what's been really interesting over the last few years is that clearly everybody feels vulnerable, because the requests for assistance, the requests for support come from everywhere. And we work across fragile and conflict-affected states. We work across low-income countries, fast-growing economies, middle-income countries. We even get requests for assistance from high-income countries now. And the kinds of confluence of the recurring intensity of natural disasters, spurred on by climate change, and then the fact that conflict it continues to be with us is really, I think, brought to the fore the fact that everybody's thinking about this. So the kinds of requests we get are from what has already been mentioned. So requests for, how do we think through what our risk is? How do we understand the degree to which we are or are not resilient as a country, or for example, as a city or as a sub-region of a country. And then, we get requests for, okay, well, we've got some basic risk assessment in place, but how do we think about integrating that into our development planning? How do we build the kind of long-term view that Mexico started to take, 10 years ago, some cities have managed to do, some other countries have managed to do. And then we get specific requests for help for, thinking through what are the ways in which this becomes investable. How do we think about the particular financial mechanisms that we need in order to manage our risk, and that might be insurance tools, etc. And there's enough happening now around the world that there's a lot of people wanting to learn from other parts of the world. So the Pacific wants to understand how catastrophic risk has been working in the Caribbean. There may be some financial innovation around crop insurance in East Africa, which other parts of the world want to understand. So I think that that's really important. And then last year, we actually received a request from the G20, where the G20 wanted to understand how they should be thinking about resilience and the impact that resilience could have on, or the impact of risk management, the impact that risk management could have on financial resilience. So you actually now see disaster risk and reduction at the centre of a really widespread, or the beginning to be a widespread understanding of the fact that you need to manage financial resilience. You need to, as a country, so we know after the financial crisis that many rich countries now have completely spent down their buffers and actually are very unresilient. And I think it's interesting to look at the story of New Zealand and how they've had to completely re-engineer the way they think about their debt and their budget as a result of the catastrophe in begins with C, anyway, jet lag. Canterbury. There you go. So, this happens to high-income countries as well. So financial resilience, national resilience, resilience at the community level, resilience at the fundamentally at the household level. And I think what we're seeing is countries trying to build into their existing development planning the mechanisms that help them become more resilient. So for us, it's more and more requests for assistance, which I'll come back to later. We're not really in a great position as an international community to respond to. And everybody's vulnerable. This does not discriminate. This is for the rich, the poor, and everybody in the middle.
Disasters come in all shapes and sizes, and I'd like to hear from Mark Shaderly now how Nestle has changed its approach to risk management over the time that you've been in charge of, at the nerve center of this, as it were. And I mean, you at Nestle had a great big shock, didn't you, not so long ago?
Thank you, Nisha. So we started actually to build up a more coordinated approach on risk management 12 years ago. But actually, we, as a company, we experience what I would call disaster in a numerous way and on a continuous basis, because we are present with our activity in 150 countries. And actually, it would take much too long to list all the disasters I've seen now over the last 12 years. And what I also see is that actually the supply chain, our supply chain, has fundamentally changed over the last 12 years. We have become much more reliant on just-in-time, reducing working capital, obviously in the way that we should be more efficient. But all of that has actually really put us or exposed us much more for any kind of smaller or larger event. And now ourselves, as a large organization, will always have sufficient resources to deal with these events, with these disasters. But we have a supply chain We have 690,000 farmers delivering product to us directly. 2 to 3 million other farmers indirectly providing products to us. Or we have 100,000 suppliers delivering products to us, which are relevant for us. All those small, medium-sized organizations, they will be much more impacted in case of such events. And we really see that over the last years. And all these efforts which have been described here will help these small, medium-sized organizations, enterprises. And if they can deliver their products, we will be able to continue to produce our product. Therefore, the collaboration is essential.
And we're going to explore that further, really.
Yes.
How governments and private sector can collaborate better, which is the best sharing of responsibilities in different parts of the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Shadley. So, we've given you an overview now on how different countries and different organizations view the financing of disaster risk management at an early stage so that economies, livelihoods, peoples can be more resilient and more robust in the face of disasters. Yes, great in theory, great aspirations. We all sign up to this stuff, I'm sure. But how do you actually deliver it? How do you translate it into action? How do you make this joined-up thinking a reality, in other words? So I'm going to now ask some questions around public investment. How do you make sure that it has disaster risk management principles woven into it from the beginning? And Minister Boulif from Morocco, give us an idea, since Morocco has such a very coordinated way of looking at risk management now. How do you make sure that the investment projects that are being commissioned really do have a DRM perspective in them from the beginning? I mean, are you having to negotiate quite hard with your fellow ministers?
Yes. Obviously, the question of funding, as you know, is an incredibly important one, but we should also remember that the key thing is to prevent before events, and that therefore we need to ensure that investment is properly directed in advance of the disaster, during it, and also following it. So there are three types, if you like, and three levels of funding. In Morocco, we think that there are several possibilities. There's the state funding, that is the budget from the state that's centrally allocated, and there's also the second level from the state budget, and that's an insurance policy against risk, so that's the state level. But then we have collectivity level at the regional and the commune levels. They also have to invest, and that also has an impact on terms of the total budget. And so we need to look at our risk prevention at these different levels. There's also public-private partnerships, which we've also instigated between businesses. First of all, those who are particularly interested in risk management, but also at the national level, we have a charter which has been drawn up between government and the private sector, and that's to ensure that common projects, cross-cutting projects, which relate to the whole raft of the population in the country, have a range of stakeholders. We've passed a law which was passed through Parliament.
That's a really clear exposition, thank you. It's really helped me to see it better. But can you point to a project, a cross-cutting project, which has been commissioned and has the resources behind it, which would not have happened before this kind of thinking, this kind of action plan was brought into place? But that is the child of this kind of thinking.
Well, for the moment, it's the state budget to date which has been managing all of our natural disaster management, and so we've either had direct subsidies through the disaster management budget. We've got two large funds, one for disasters themselves. Generally, these are agricultural disasters, so drought and so on and so forth, and we have a dedicated fund which has been divided out in terms of years. So last year, we managed to subsidize 400 communes. This is around 1.5 billion dirhams. That's about 150 million euros. And then we have another fund which deals with coverage. And so the aim there is to allow a number of farmers to cover themselves in terms of insurance and so provide for individual risks they might be confronting. And at the moment, we're in the process of negotiating in terms of dealing with commodities and also agriculture, because we're an extremely significant country. Around 90% of our energy comes from local sources, and while oil prices are up, we're in the process of negotiating in that area and also with international financial associations. And so we're looking at doing that in order to risk manage and use those subsidies at a local level.
Mr. Woody, thank you so much. Mr. Littell, I think you want to come into it. I heard you earlier talking about a whole government approach.
Oui, mais je voudrais ça. Oui, c'est une partie du whole of government approach.
Yes, absolutely. The whole government approach, it's just to add to the statement by the Moroccan minister. I think from the government point of view, there's a number of means at their disposal to strengthen sustainability in terms of risk management. There's a number of investments which will allow them to, in a cost-effective way, guarantee that. There's a number of examples from the European continent. During budgetary decisions which are made in order to deal with public funds, it's vital to ensure that the shortfall in the budget, and it's often the minister who will decide yes or no whether or not a certain budget is going to be added to. It's to ensure that there's a quality control, but also a control that ensures that there's sustainability that is dealt with in terms of risk management, and that's taken into account at that budgetary stage, and that's something which maybe has been ignored in the past. And
well, it's when you have essential governmental decisions in terms of investment in an infrastructure, in a road, in building a new infrastructure, that besides the opinion by the corps of federal budgetary inspectors, besides the opinion concerning the legality of the expenditure, that there is also in the same procedure at least a benchmark whether the project is really resilient to catastrophes. I know that from my experience that in Europe, step by step, it's becoming generalized that in lots of countries, when a dossier is brought to the Council of Ministers, is brought to the body that has to decide, that there's an opinion on not only about the legality from a budgetary point of view and from a point of view of the laws, but also about is this project as an infrastructure, as a road, is it meeting minimum criteria in terms of being confronted with natural catastrophes.
And weaving that in from an early stage. Thank you. I can see Mr. Puente is nodding away.
Yes, I just wanted to give a specific example on the issue that we're dealing with here. For example, in 2011, Hurricane Alex took out nearly the entire central portion of the city of Bolivia, a very industrial city in Mexico. And when the National Disaster Fund, which is the money that the government provides, was dedicated for the reconstruction of the city, the participation of civil society, business people and the government itself formed a council which looked at analysing, not reconstructing the risk management in the way that it was done before, but to look at how to reconstruct all of the infrastructure in a new way. They dedicated a project in order to ensure that we didn't make the same mistakes that were made when the first infrastructures were laid down in the first place, and to ensure that the new infrastructure was resilient. In 2 years, they finished reconstruction with a very tightly knitted cooperation from society, civil society, and the government, which allowed the way in which the audit even was carried out in a civil society basis to ensure that if the same hurricane or a similar hurricane was to pass through the same area, the new infrastructure that had been constructed wouldn't be weak and vulnerable in the same way as they had beforehand. This was finished in May, and it really is is a blueprint in the country, and I think it gives us an example of how to move forwards in the same situation.
Rachel Kite, sustainability, close to your heart.
Yeah, I think what you've got here is, you know, a sequence of governments who, first of all, exhibit some of the key fundamental building blocks that are needed, right? So you've got some kind of sustainability of the actual government, right? You've got some kind of framework of government that is able to take a long-term view. You know, call it democratic, call it stable, call it whatever you want. Secondly, you've got governments that have invested in the data and evidence. And so they have the data and evidence in front of some ability to take a long-term view. Then you've got some kind of authorising environment to make difficult expenditure decisions. Because what governments have to do is think about not only avoiding future risk, i.e. the way you're going to build the new infrastructure, but for those who have some kind of infrastructure, it's reducing the risk of that infrastructure that's already there. And those are expensive decisions. And these are governments that have some kind of fiscal policy management in place that allows them to, have the analysis and then make a decision of consequence afterwards. And I think, you know, what we have to do is sort of ask ourselves, how can we help everybody be Morocco or Mexico? Because that is simply not in place for most low-income countries. That's certainly not in place for countries that are really stretched. So, I mean, let's just look at the Caribbean today, right, with the kind of, an impending hurricane season, which might be, the equivalent of shock and awe, right? I mean, the predictions are really quite severe. And a series of countries with incredible fiscal burdens. Just thinking through, what the planning decisions are and the frameworks and where the money is going to come from. We'll get to where the international community's got to support. I mean, those are awesome decision making. And so I think that we all together are going to have to help these countries think through the consequences of not having been able to do that for the last 10 years. But I mean, if we can help everybody be Morocco or Mexico, we'd be in very good state.
So a number of different players working together, long-term plans, analysis. Monsieur Soudibe, did I see you wanted to say something?
Just to add that in the strategy that we've developed, the private sector has been very much taken into account, and it plays an extremely active role. And so that's why we've been stepping up agricultural production. We've been developing professional expertise with professional training. That's going to allow us to stabilize production, which isn't the case at the moment. And as one colleague said, when production isn't stable, supply is not ensured in a regular and ongoing way. The market can't rely on it, and the private sector has difficulty setting itself up. And so that's what the strategy is aiming to deal with. But we're also working through insurance funds. The Agricultural Bank has just set up a natural calamity fund. And we've also signed a protocol to participate in the African Union's insurance mutual assurance policy. That's been set up at the level of the whole continent to deal with risk management. And so I think with all of that, we think that the private sector is finding its role, and that will develop in Niger over the coming years. Thank you.
Dr. Yoga, who's sitting very patiently in the corner, to give us your perspective on this private sector, public sector. How can they work together? How do we realistically allocate these roles? I mean, it's very easy to talk in very grand terms about this, sharing responsibilities and all that, but what does it actually mean?
Okay, thank you. I was trying to respond to your first question on the public investment, because it is very much related to the commitment, the political commitment from the government. And for instance, like government of Indonesia already put the priority for the national development. One of it is for the disaster management, mostly in the disaster risk reduction. That's why if I try to maybe reiterate the second session of the global platform in 2009. That 1% of the total national budget is supposed to be dedicated for the DRR. Yeah. Indonesia already almost 1% actually.
So but has it been creeping up in Indonesia?
And it is increasing over the time actually. And along with the Aceh and also the Yogyakarta experience in building up the Build Back Better principles on the recovery process, we've already put our budget also 10% at least for the DDR investment for the recovery process. Means that we are very committed actually in dealing with the DRR since the very beginning of the national priority as well as the investment on the public side. Related to the private sector, of course, it is going to be very difficult situation in terms of, because in most developing countries like Indonesia, most of the private sector related to the small and medium size, maybe micro. This is not really happening like what Switzerland have, maybe like in Europe. Maybe most of the private sector can be invited and can be contribute significantly in the investment of DRR. But in the developing countries, it is going to be very difficult situation in terms of how the private sector will go on the investment of the DRR if the budget limitation or investment limitation for the private sector, which is very small and medium and micro, cannot afford to that kind of.
This is why I was asking, what can you seriously expect these small companies to do?
That's the one that we have been trying also to back in Aceh and also in Yogyakarta experience, working with them actually. For instance, like with the banking sector, because we know that most of them has problems with the credit, how to they respond to the credit sector, and we try to also having the banking system also try to have some collateral related with the investment for the DRR, or even maybe the interest rate of the credit will be maybe adjusted related to how the private sector related can invest to the DRR. But for the private, big private sector, let me give some example on how the steel company give some contribution for the disaster or earthquake resistance small medium enterprise related with the big enterprises. And then also like the Danone, for instance, or Nestle in Indonesia, also helping the government a lot actually in helping something like the water preservation, and also some cattle production is going to be very significant if you are trying to talk about the big private sector. But the one of the problem is still struggling in our country is how we try to drag all the small and medium and also micro enterprises to be also contributing to the investment of DRR.
Yeah, we have to be realistic. Thank you, Dr. Yoga. Mark Shadley.
Yes, so I just wanted to pump on your request, actually, to show a few examples. And one of those is really what we do as part of creating shared value. This is a sustainability program which we have in place, and where we actually work with the farmers to protect their wells. Protect against what? Actually against water. Because in case of a larger flood, one of the big problems for the farmers is the contamination of the water. And if the wells are better protected, after the flood, the hurdles will be healthier, will not be as sick, and also the farmers themselves will not have health issues if their water is not contaminated. And this is something I would call which can be done in a very simple way, but obviously 690,000 farmers, you cannot just do that like this, right? Another example, I attended 3 weeks ago to a workshop actually organized by ILO, the International Labour Organization, where we were training small, medium-sized enterprises to think about business continuity. in a very, very pragmatic way. Because, again, no need for large books. That's, you just forget.
So thinking about what then?
Really thinking about what kind of events could be crucial for them and how they, in a very simple way, could be better prepared in case of. This was really the part of that training. 2 examples.
So you've been talking about how Nestle is trying to make its supply chain more resilient and help its small and medium-sized farms anticipate and protect against risks. What do you look for from governments? What do you want to see more of? We're hearing about best practice here. What are you not seeing or hearing enough of, Mr. Shadley?
Now, I think we heard a lot about identification, about the evaluation of the impact, and this is excellent because that's the very first stage, is to raise awareness. Now, one thing which is essential is to maintain that information, because the world is changing, the external environment is changing, and therefore, especially the impacts could be changing over time. That's one thing, maintenance. And then the second thing is, I think, about communication of that. Creating the urgencies may be the wrong word, but creating the sense of awareness that we need to be prepared. Now, Murphy's Law will say that what you prepared for will never happen. But if you are flexible enough, what you prepared for can be used for the real event.
The process of preparedness gives you new muscles, which can be used in other areas. Now, we started off saying this is a discussion about the financing of disaster risk management, and I wanted to, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, have a little bit of a technical discussion, slightly more technical discussion. Can we look a little bit at insurance schemes, funding mechanisms? We've been hearing a little bit from Mr. Puente, a little bit from Minister Boulif, bank schemes from Dr. Yoga. What has worked and what has not worked, so that other people in this room don't waste time doing things that you have already tried and really have not worked. Can you give us some guidance? Mr. Puente, how about you start us off?
One of the subjects we're talking about a lot right now for national coordination is infrastructure. To date, this hasn't really worked. We haven't defined the policies, and after 2,000 million pesos worth of damage, then they'll begin to pay. We've had a number of years with floods and rain, and we haven't resolved the issue over this period, and we have to resolve it on an international level with the insurers so that we can come out with parameters that will help us make sure that we have enough funds to deal with reconstruction and develop greater resilience. This is a subject that many countries are now facing. We pay for the policies, and then we need the money for reconstruction, and we have to be able to get it back when the time comes to rebuild.
Important point, thank you. And you might want to ask Mr. Puente more on that in the Q&A session. Anyone else want to join into this? Minister Boulif?
No,
on these funding mechanisms?
I just wanted to move a little further in this. In Morocco, we have another system. It falls in for risk management, and that is compensation of prices. The state, especially when there are risk issues, the state reimburses and gives a special subsidy for petrol or cane sugar and for wheat. So when we have these risk situations, we can find the bank that will help us give out subsidies afterwards and also beforehand. Not only money paid to the farmers, but the industries as well, help the factories, so that essential products that are consumed greatly in our households will be produced.
But do you fund that out of current revenues, or do you have a fund set aside, like a kind of self-insured fund?
Yes, we have a budget that addresses this, but we go beyond the budget by about 30%, so under $40 billion, we have $5.5 billion euros, and we've had a crisis in 2008, and then afterwards we had a flood that affected the production of wheat and sugar, and so the state has had to subsidize this with a large amount of money, representing up to 50% for small farmers for their annual expenses.
Thank you. Rachel Kite.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of a general observation is that I think that the insurance markets and the reinsurance markets are, still underdeveloped in most developing countries, and the transfer of risk from the state onto the private sector is absolutely key. And because, I mean, the easy way to think about it is that, the government is the ultimate insurance company. And any risk that you don't transfer into a managed way into the private sector is going to come back eventually to the public purse. And so I think this is a priority. And I think there's been a lot of sophistication and a lot of advancement in the way that Europe and some of the developed OECD countries have managed this. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from Japan and from New Zealand in recent years. There's a lot to be learned from Mexico and others who've really built out these systems nationwide. You've got discrete products which are now available in the developing world, from catastrophe bonds to some weather-related insurance schemes.
But Rachel, do you feel confident they will deliver as they are supposed to? Because we just heard from Mr. Puente about how disappointing the
No, I think you learn and you tweak and you learn and you tweak. So we know that some of the parametric insurance schemes have not worked, and so you learn that you've got that wrong, and you need to so it's constantly going to be. You're not going to get it right the first time. But do
you feel confident that we're getting
what I'm confident of is if we don't find a way to involve the private sector in taking some of the risk off the state, we are not going to be able to afford to do what we need to do in the face of what we know is going to come at us in terms of disasters over the next decades. And so we have to figure this out one way or the other. I mean, we're going to bankrupt ourselves otherwise.
Okay, well, that was throwing down the gauntlet. Minister Sidibé, 1 second, Mr. Boulif.
I'd like to say that we have a kind of indirect insurance. When the producers lose their crops due to lack of rain or bad rain, then the state will intervene and give them pesticide and agricultural material in general, agricultural supplies, so that they can produce their crops again after the rains have stopped. And then they can produce more than the deficit. But this, at the same time, since our country is rather weak, we have agreements so that
nos interventions à travers certains critères que nous sommes amenés à respecter.
And we have to follow the provisions of these agreements, but it has worked in 2011, 2012, and now we are going to be moving towards private insurance. We have to stabilize our system We have to develop expertise, and it is the public system that's doing it now, and that's quite costly for the time being.
Are you saying that you're feeling that you think that by putting in the public investments to show that you are stabilizing the system, you will be able to then get private insurance into this sphere, so that in future you won't have to be paying out of the public purse every time there's a famine crisis?
Well, this is going to happen as we move forward. We have private insurance is private, and as we progress, as we move ahead gradually and we gain greater control over production, then we will be able gradually to have more formal provisions concerning production and transformation, and a new system will be set up. But meanwhile, it is the public system that is in charge of insurance, and this is quite costly. Thank you. I just wanted to go back to what our colleague from the World Bank said. We have a certain number of countries in the developing world that have not really acceded to this kind of system. But I think people need to learn about this. We have to reach out and do some outreach and explain, teach them. I am, for example, I'm under contract, and if somebody says to me, we have to reinsure risks, and they tell me you'll have to pay €1 billion per year, and this is quite a large amount. So how can we convince politicians, instead of doing value-added taxes, for example, I'm being told that I have put €1 billion aside just in case, and so we have to teach them and instruct them. We need to have greater cooperation, for example. We have certain experience in terms of reinsurance and transfer of very specialized instruments that are very high-tech, but not everybody has this experience. And we have, for example, we can have different organizations share, and private and public, who have had to address a certain number of risks in the transport area, for example, and they can. It's not easy to move forward unless we have been taught to use these different instruments, and we share them, and we work through the different institutions like the World Bank and private institutions as well in working in that area.
Thanks, Minister Boulif. You can see they work closely together. Mr. Leterme.
I just wanted to make two comments about reinsuring people for natural disasters. The public authorities have to play a role. We have to set up the right framework. It is clear that we're talking about countries whose insurance coverage, that is the number of people who have already taken out insurance policies, is high. Well, we know that we have the idea of universal service. Everybody knows that they can, and they have access to this insurance policy. Another example would be that there's a certain amount of obligation or ideas of solidarity that we should introduce. It is clear that somebody living on the 56th floor is more interesting, is more worthwhile for the insurance company to insure than somebody who's living on the first floor. But there is an important role that the public authorities must play in setting the conditions.
We've had such a rich discussion so far, ending on talking about insurance and funding, but we started off looking at public investment as a whole, how to make sure that we have joined up investment policies. Can you hear me at the back? Because I'm about to come to the back. I have the mic. So who's going to grab the mic off me and put the first question? Please tell us who you are, sir. It's on.
Thank you very much. I'm from Bangladesh. I want to comment on the presentation that made by the Honorable Minister from the Indonesia, is really fact that for the disaster risk reduction, the private sector is a bit reluctant. I can give you some example. The very recent example, you might have heard about the building collapse in Bangladesh, where more than 1,000 people died and more than 2,000 people rescued. So the lot of private sectors, private companies, private, public, and the individuals, they helped a lot through medicine, finance, money, and so on. They're very much keen to support to the rescuers, to Red Cross, to the government, to the army. But if you go for having support for risk reduction efforts, they are a bit reluctant. So I do support your comment that we need to have more proactive and to communicate with the public sectors so that they can feel they're responsible to support for the disaster risk management and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An echo here, Dr. Yoga. Let's have a question from the far end, Alina.
My name is Erling Kvarnevik. I'm from Norway. I have a question for the panel. There is a principle we are challenging with climate change, and there's a principle that the polluter has to pay. And the polluter in many ways is the private companies. And they have to, I think, accept in the future to pay more for the pollution, for the emissions. I wonder what the views are on having global taxes. There is a global tax suggested by a Nobel laureate called Tobin, which is a tax on currency transactions. There are other taxes that are suggested as taxes on flights. Is this something that the private companies are happy to pay as they are polluters?
Well, you certainly know they're not happy to pay, but is it even a sensible question to be asking? Rachel Kite.
Well, I think there's two components to your question. First is there is a concept of climate justice. So the extreme weather events are bringing to the forefront now the fact that the poor and the most vulnerable are paying now for what has not been done in the past decades to mitigate carbon emissions. What the transfer mechanism is to address that climate justice is, at the global level, a very difficult debate. I think that what we see is, notwithstanding the necessity of that moral debate, and it is a moral issue, as well as an economic issue and everything else, that it is, no longer can developing countries wait while we have that moral fight with each other. I mean, so in the here and now, developing countries have to invest in their own resilience. And so the question then is, at a domestic level, for foreign and domestic companies, how are they going to make sure that their businesses are resilient? And they have a responsibility to do that. That means that the public sector has a responsibility to make the data available so that the company can understand what its lack of resilience is, make sure it is resilient so that it can keep on paying salaries through the crisis. So when the disaster hits, people have their jobs not 10 months later, but 10 days later. That's a responsibility that has to be dealt with at the domestic level. As for the financial transactions tax, and these things, I think we wrote a paper together with the IMF for the G20, I can't remember which cycle, 18 months ago, where we pointed out that they haven't worked in the past. I think Sweden introduced a financial transactions tax in the 90s, it didn't work. The only thing I'd say about the FTT now and the 9 countries in Europe that have agreed to actually do it is that the development community wants the proceeds of that tax, the climate change community wants the proceeds of that tax, the global health community wants the proceeds of that tax, and then everybody who doesn't have a job and can't afford their way out of austerity wants the proceeds of that tax. So even once you've put the tax in place, whether or not the proceeds of that will actually filter their way down to resilience of the poorest in the world, I don't know. So I think there's probably, look, the simple, most elegant thing to do is for everybody to either have a carbon tax or a market-based mechanism, put a price on carbon, and you would start seeing investment flow to where it's really needed. Absent that, absent political leadership about that, everything is going to be hard work.
Mark Shadley.
I would just support your very last comment. if there are enough incentives for the public, for the private companies, I don't see why it should not work. But actually the governments, again, will have to provide, to put the policies in place to provide the framework for that.
Great, thank you. The next question is here, and then the gentleman in the middle.
A question for Don Luis Felipe. What was the biggest conceptual hurdle that you met when moving from a response fund to a risk reduction fund?
The most important factor was that we had to involve more than $10,000 million, and only part of it was put aside for prevention. And so we're looking for mechanisms to reverse the trend and clearly identify the risk areas so that we can see the vulnerabilities and avoid risk, so that we cannot construct the same thing that we had before. We have to look at the risk and improve based on the different characteristics. Now, building national infrastructure is given sometimes to the private sector. And sometimes when you build a road, there are shortcomings because they may be built in areas where there are cyclones and hurricanes. And the private sector will have greater responsibility in terms of the characteristics of the road. And this is what happened in Spain. There was a landslide, and this was a tragedy, and the builders have to accept responsibility. We have to have evaluators, or we have to have auditors. In our case, we have that within the sector of prevention of disasters, and they will have to establish the areas that are liable to have landslides or problems, and they will have to pay the insurance costs. This is our new policy.
Minister Sidibe, do you want to check in? So the question was, what was the change you had to make in the conceptual framework, moving from disaster response to risk management?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I would just like to go back to the question that where the World Bank had answered. The polluter should pay. That's all well and good, but it's very hard to implement because, as the World Bank has just said, this is a national issue. So it doesn't actually work in terms of national insurance, because when you have an insurance that's in one country and you have a company that goes to another country, and so insofar as this is not global and systemic, then it's a problem. This should be changed so that in the future we can have adequate coverage.
Thank you. Fingers crossed. Next question.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Bueno, hemos escuchado durante estos días
in the past few days and today as well, we've heard about how important it is to have structures. But I always thought in order for this to happen, we have to have resilient people, not just resilient countries. Now, in terms of prevention, very little has been said about financing or support that are used to build or to prevent that something be destroyed again. So I think that the time has come now to change these paradigms and to look for such support for prevention, but in terms of people. And this will have a greater effect. There are funds, there is financing that promotes this kind of prevention. Actually, that's my question. Does that exist?
Okay, does anyone want to pick up on that? Resilient people? Minister Boulif, you have a mischievous smile on your face.
Non, c'est juste, effectivement, l'intervention qui vient juste.
Well, what has just been said is very important. I'm not saying we should change the trend, but we should walk alongside of both mechanisms, prevention and another, that will ensure that we can react once the disaster has occurred. Prevention, generally speaking, will have a cost, but it will be a lower cost. Let me give you an example. You have a country where private sector will put, somebody in the private sector will put their computer and equipment in the basement, and every time there's a rain or a flood, they'll have to pay. Well, we just need to have a decree or a little law saying that where things should be stored, and that doesn't require a great deal of investment. And so, and I'd like to go back to the private sector. We had an experience concerning a flood that took place 4 years ago in an industrial area, and happily it had been built right where unfortunately where a river went by, and more than 50% of the industrial zone was affected. So now, since this hit the private sector so hard, now everybody is aware of the problem in Morocco, and everybody is ready to chip in terms of prevention. So education and investing in education and prevention is essential. So when it has been said at high-level meetings that we should make sure that we work not only on the infrastructure, but we should mention that we should invest as well in awareness raising and in education, and this will help in terms of prevention.
Good answer. Thank you. Dr. Yoga.
Okay. Actually, I would like to get both from Bangladesh and the last one. Okay, the private sector maybe not really, the rate of response is maybe much higher in the response post-disaster, of course. But on the recovery process, we can do investment on the DRR. That's the one that we would like to share on the basis of Change Jakarta under the multi-donor fund investment, and also private sector investment there, contribution. Most of the activities actually related to how we invest the DRR into the recovery process means indirectly the money coming from the private sector also investing in the DRR. Even though this is going to be good quality housing, but if it is not safe to the future disaster, that's nonsense. So that's the way we are trying to see that, okay, maybe the rate of response is much less than the response. But if we are trying to manage the response, trying also to invest the DRR, maybe it's worth it to see that it's already been investing to the DRR. And then the second one on the community participation, it is also, I would like to share also in Jogja and Aceh case on what we call the community-based housing reconstruction. The money can coming from other parties, from the private sector, from the donors, from the partners, agencies, but in doing such reconstruction, the people is the actor. We never had the contractors or the developer building up the housing, but the people building up the housing. And they try, what the government is doing is only doing the facilitating the community to know the knowledge to build build better the housing. So it will be, resilient for the future disaster. So that's the way we are trying to manage such DRR investment indirectly from the private sector as well.
Thanks, Dr. Yoga. Let's have another question. The lady in the third row, and then later the gentleman at the back. Let's hear from both of you, one after the other. Please go.
My name is Dawn Zimmer. I'm the mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey, and we were severely impacted by Hurricane Sandy. 80% of our city was flooded. We're right across the river from New York City. So my question is, is there an opportunity to work more on the local level as well? And is there a model, or could a model be created to really evaluate the risks for all of the different partners? I mean, I would love to try and figure out a way to have a partnership between the city of Hoboken, the existing businesses, the future development. There's a lot of redevelopment areas in Hoboken, New Jersey Transit, Port Authority. These are all federal agencies that were, state and federal agencies that were impacted, and trying to figure out, how do you evaluate that risk? How do you calculate what that risk is to decide what's a fair amount for each entity to put funds in? That's the challenge, is what is that fair way to move forward? I think that it could happen, but how do you create that framework to figure out a fair way to evaluate the costs that everyone should put in to try and move it forward? Because we're trying to look at our substations flood on a regular basis, not just during Hurricane Sandy. But
that was a great question. I'd love to hear the answer. Who wants to pick up on that? How does one create that framework? Mr. Puente, go for it.
Clearly, if there are models that allow us to evaluate risk for cyclones or floods, well, we in our national centers and we have programs. We have the Atlantic, we have the Pacific, and we have a number of cyclones and storms in Mexico, above all in the east. And we have been able to evaluate the situation year by year and with the weather forecasting organizations, and see the dimensions of the hurricanes and what populations will be affected, together with a national system, so that we can identify which population, what the characteristics of the infrastructure will be. So we have to be able to qualify the amount of damage that will be caused, and we can diagnose the results, and this exists. And I can say that we have a central national program that does so. Now, I would also like to say that we also have sources to take care of people's lives in terms of prevention and reconstruction. They do exist. These resources do exist. We, in municipal plans, state plans, so that the people won't continue to live in these basin areas that are in danger. And then we're not going to, and then we try to move them out, and if they are living in these basin areas, we place them and we evaluate the risks.
Maybe continue the conversation in the break. We've just time for one more question. The gentleman at the very back. Please make it short, sir.
Thank you. My name is Victor Rambet. I'm from Indonesia, representing the private sectors. Of course, I would like to comment about the being reluctant, because it's true that some of the private sectors cannot do or do not do what the business as usual DRR, and therefore we need to at least fine tune or talk the same language, because from the private sector perspective, financing for disaster risk management is not only about money. We are not donors. We are not INGO. We are not nothing, but we could do something based on resources available. And of course, from the language of private sectors, DRR is already there. It's when we talk about corporate sustainability, it's not just it's talking about how a profit. I mean, DRR is actually securing the profit of the private sectors, and that's already integrated in the corporate sustainability when we're talking about the people, planet, and the profit. And therefore, I think what we would need to do is to do more coordinations and to talk more same language, fine-tunes about the expectations of the government, expectations of all other stakeholders in doing disaster risk reductions. And by doing so, I think some of the private sectors could do even better, could do the fine-tuning, and I realize the reluctance of the private sectors is still there, but we could do better in the future. Thank you.
So you need to do a road show and motivate people. And on that very positive note, I shall simply say that our 1.5 hours has flown by. We've covered all manner of different subjects, and there's more to discuss from public investment, from analytical frameworks, from various funding mechanisms. Shall we show our appreciation to our eminent panelists, Dr. Yoga, Mr. Shadley, Minister Sidibe, Mr. Littell, Rachel Kite, Mr. Puente, Minister Bonif,